So I don't know about you, but I've never formally studied psychology, though I've always had an interest in it. I've always just been fascinated about people and why they do the things they do, and trying to think up models and such to understand people and to almost generalize them, like see their loops or patterns and such. So, this is a bit about psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, and we'll get into all those in a minute. Firstly, so I asked DeepSeek about what essentially are the major parts of psychology, because it's a bit like I saw this picture of mathematics and it had every single field like algebra, geometry, just regular, addition, division, all this kind of stuff. I was like, wow, that's fascinating. You could just get one of those and then learn everything about mathematics in a very general sense, right? So we can do the same with the AI. So the first is biological. So essentially, this is our body and our brain and our hormones and genetics. It's what's going on in the body. And it's you want to think like what is going on in the body that is causing someone to do something. And the next one is cognitive. And this it's interesting, they related it to software. Well, this one's more the hardware. The cognitive is essentially your mental scape. So it's what you're thinking, your thought loops and such. The idea that our mind dictates our perception of reality. And I think that to an extent is true, but I think people like to take it out of context. Someone said, how do I know that we're seeing the same color? Personally, I think unless you have a very severe issue with your brain or your eyes or something in between, we're all seeing the same color. Now, I'm trained more as an artist, so I can look at colors and differentiate them a little bit more. But ultimately, we're still having, think we're still having the same general experience. But as I said, my training as an artist is partially, I guess, my cognitive sense. So I'm able to look at things and to divide them maybe a bit stronger than other people. I might have more words to describe how the light hits things and changes the colors and all this kind of stuff, right? So we can look at it as cognitive. Then is behavioral. And this is essentially related to almost like a loop of input output of your experience in reality and the environment and how it affects you. If there's lots of food at home, maybe you will eat the food at home, right? If there's not, maybe you will go to the shops and you'll buy more food or you'll eat out. If the environment is raining, you might not want to go out, or, depending on you, maybe you do want to go out. Then we have social and cultural, which is how other people and my culture influence who I am. And this one is a little more complicated today because of all the multiculturalism. But essentially, you can think like, how does your family influence you and how does your race influence you? Each race has different characteristics and such, and this will influence people in different ways. And you'll notice that all of these thus far are essentially subconscious. Besides the cognitive is much more conscious. Behavioral's half and half, I guess, and then developmental. So this is a very important one, which is childhood traumas, right? And childhood conditioning and experience. If you had a good childhood, generally you will go on to be a competent and healthy and proper adult. If you didn't, then you have 5, 10, 15, 20 years of psychological, physical, and other healing to do, essentially. I always think if you look at a child and they run around and they're being, playing, and it's just, I try not to judge myself for the things that I might have done as a child. Of course, you have to forgive yourself if you did bad things, apologize to the others in your mind, but otherwise forgive yourself for these things because, a child is very immature, very undeveloped, and, they're just gonna be what a child is, right? Now, these are interesting because I think they explain a lot of unconscious behavior and behavior in general of a person. And I think that people sometimes study psychology and philosophy because they actually are interested in spirituality. Jungian psychology, for example, starts to get into this, and then like Hermetic philosophy or something starts to get into the spiritual realm or philosophy. Unfortunately, these fields, while they can intermix, are not spirituality. Now, I almost see psychology as like in a very American field, where I would imagine American corporations probably really pioneered a lot of this stuff. I believe there's some work, what was it, like nearly 100 years ago, about corporate psychology and such, because if you can model people and all of the races in that country, and all of the major areas and groups and such, then you can kind of figure out what they will buy and all this kind of stuff, and you can put it in a computer program, and it's actually very almost a little creepy. But so this is interesting, which is philosophy. The metaphysics is what is real, what exists, what is the nature of reality. So it's essentially a checking mechanism to ask, is this thing real, or is it just imaginary or non-existent or something? Does this table exist? Does this person exist? Etc. And again, we have to just to go back to the idea where people think, oh, well, who knows what everyone's perception of reality is. I do think things do exist. This idea that nothing exists and everything is just, I don't know, some schizophrenic delusion of some people's imagination. I don't think that's true. I think things exist whether you exist or not. The world will continue to exist. So yeah, next one is epistemology. What can we know? How do we know what we know? What is truth? So again, this one is a very much a checking mechanism. It's almost like a thing to make sure that science is clean and proper and such, because you would think that it's possible that various sciences would collect incorrect knowledge, and then you have philosophy to debate knowledge, to essentially say, yes, this is correct, we know this because of this. And this one is how do we know this? What is true? How do we know? So it's very much related to, for science, you have the scientific method of like testing things out and proving them, and repeating the experiment, and then kind of making like generalized laws or theories and such of how the world works. So just when things repeat, usually it would be true, right? And then ethics, what is right and wrong, how should we live? And morality, people debate, of course, morality. I think morality is reasonably generalized. You can generalize it, and it can be an obvious thing. I think the unnecessary causing of pain to other humans or animals, or even plants for that matter, is unnecessary and immoral. I think it's pretty obvious when you hear something scream out, it's obviously something bad, right? So again, people love to debate morality, and I just see it as I think a lot of people have done bad things, and they don't want to admit that they've done bad things. And because of that, they essentially use philosophy and psychology and other things as a way to change their perception instead of dealing with the trauma of the bad things they've done. So, which is why we get the debates for all these things. Logic. So what constitutes valid reasoning and argument? How do we distinguish good arguments from bad ones? So this one is look into like Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy. They talk a lot about logic. I'll just say you're relying on epistemology for logic. How do we know what we know, what is truth? So logic is almost like the mathematics of truth, maybe. So I see logic almost as, how do we make formulas to know what is correct? Eventually, once you have enough knowledge, the knowledge
becomes, you can see a pattern in the knowledge, is the best way to put it. And this is a very high concept. It's something very far removed from, you know, an animal in the wild running and hunting and all this kind of stuff. Like, this is the kind of thing which takes great civilization, you know, building up, and great amounts of age and wisdom to enter the state, until you can get to a point where you can see that there are patterns in knowledge itself, which is logic. Essentially, they're almost these rules, and it's like archetypes, but not quite, for logic. And then we can use that to reason why one thing would be and why another thing, etc.
And then aesthetics, which is an interesting thing. What is beauty? What is beauty, art, and taste? Which is an interesting question, because why is something beautiful? Why isn't it? Someone said, you know, contrast is beauty. Is beauty subjective? Of course, people are going to like different things, but I do think the same way that morality is kind of inherent in a way. Beauty is inherent. There are things which are fundamentally not very beautiful. Why is it that a inexperienced amateur artist makes things that are not very nice looking time in, time again, you know, unless they are naturally gifted? You know, it's inherent thing. So finally we get to spirituality. Now, none of these things were spirituality. Philosophy I kind of summarized almost as a checker, a gatekeeper, a cleaner almost of knowledge, while psychology was more of a mostly leaning on the subconscious behavioral pattern type thing, which is why I linked it so much to like as being a corporate science. I know people are not going to like that to hear that, but at least its use is essentially, you know, I imagine corporations loved this. And then finally we have spirituality, which the issue with spirituality is that it's not respected. People think of it as, you know, foolish. And while I think that's foolish is because the books are there. You know, we have, admittedly, some of them are a little bit hard to read and they're a little bit old, but, you know, there's modern books that explain things a little easier. The techniques are there. You can do this, and spirituality really is, you know, it's the most conscious. Psychology is mostly the most subconscious. Philosophy is a little bit higher in level, and then spirituality is the highest. I think it's the highest science, because it is you in direct connection with consciousness. It is the science of, you know, consciousness and of like fundamental energetic reality and such. You know, all these meditations that you do, these internal practices, trainings and such, to, you know, improve yourself and to clean up your mind and your body and such, and to get you into connection with consciousness and such. It is the highest point. Like, there is nothing above. There is no field, no, you know, thing above this. It is, and that's why there are people who seek the divine and they don't understand that it is, you know, spirituality is where you find it, right? And then they try to seek it through art, or they try to seek it through psychology or philosophy or science or other people even. You know, you can of course find spirituality through, you know, anything. There's grains of gold within, you know, anything, I guess you could say. But ultimately what they're looking for is, you know, spirituality. And I think people they feel this sense of maybe longing or disconnection, or they just feel like there's something missing in their lives. And it's because, again, Western society has not given the crown, given the rightful place to spirituality, because it has, you know, admitting that spirituality is greater or higher than all the other sciences would be destructive to the ego of so many people, right? And I'm meaning hierarchically high. Yeah, the highest thing is a thing which deals with something that is the most, you know, subtle, energetic, right? The lowest thing is the thing that deals with the most physical. It's just how things are ordered naturally. It doesn't mean one thing isn't important and the other thing, you know, it's like if we didn't have any physical sciences, we wouldn't have all this technology, right? All this infrastructure. But yeah, I do think if meditation was normalized and, people talked about it as like a, I mean, most people don't talk about psychology, philosophy and science, right? And like material science or anything like chemistry, physics, but the people who are interested in that, if they talked about it more normally, or I mean, actually, I guess if these things were more normal in society in general, it'd be, we'd probably live a better life and all that. But really, it's just to say, like, I think we need to accept spirituality as the highest science and to treat it properly, to treat it like a science as well. We figure out different exercises and we bring it into our own language and kind of normalize it and all this stuff, same way that. So we figured out mostly psychology, because there's always more things to do. We've mostly figured out physics, right? There's always going to be more things than physics to like look into and such. But classical physics is pretty good, right? Nuclear physics we're pretty good on that. Electromagnetics, we're pretty good on a lot of this stuff. Same thing, to be honest, with spirituality, a lot of it's been figured out, but it needs to be brought into common language. So people, I mean, science in general needs to be brought into common language. Anyway, I don't know. I think I'm this probably got the point through. Yeah, so I'll leave it with that.